Welcome to Politica, a podcast that explains Israeli politics at a diaspora volume. We know that it's hard to understand the chaos and the drama that is politics in Israel, especially over the last few years. So Yuval and I are here to make it digestible, even though it doesn't always make sense. Israel's election has been called for the 27th of October. That is the last day that it could legally have been called. This government has survived and waited out its full 4-year mandate, and many say that it's trying to create memory distance between itself and the largest catastrophe in Israeli history, October the 7th. Interestingly, the date of the election has 7 and October in it. The fact that Netanyahu could not find an earlier date to call an election says a lot about how he's going into this election, and the polls show that he's actually coming in from behind. And probably if he could have waited longer, he would have. Faith in the government and in the Knesset is so low that there is plenty of speculation about things that could happen deliberately or indirectly to disrupt free and fair elections going ahead on October 27th. Now, I'm not one to entertain conspiratorial ideas, largely because most of the conspiracies around the world tend to be about Jews if you scratch the surface a little bit. But it is worth examining some of what could go wrong between now and October 27th. So Yuval, welcome. And let's start this conversation with the fact that Israel is still at war.
Israel is not only still at war, we're in the midst of another, dramatic uptick regarding Iran. It was crazy. We started this weekend, coming into this weekend, Friday morning, completely sure that it was going to happen this weekend, that we're going to go into another round with Iran. We went downstairs to our bomb shelter. We put a fan in there because it's hot. We have water. We have portable chargers, everything we need. And if you know anything about Israelis, you know that Israelis live in WhatsApp groups. So you've got the family WhatsApp group and the work WhatsApp group and the friends WhatsApp group, and everyone's talking, it's going to happen this weekend, it's going to happen this weekend. And here we are after Friday and Shabbat, and it didn't happen. Is it going to happen today? Is it going to happen tomorrow? Is it not going to happen at all? We're all living in this mix. And it's crazy. It's crazy. I mean, we went to the beach yesterday in this atmosphere of, the war might start any moment. It's almost incredible to see how Israelis in this turmoil and in this situation and in this scenario continue to do the normal Israeli thing in the summer and go to the beach.
So what would happen if there is a war? There's obviously logistical impact, but what's the political impact? Because most people would say traditional thinking is that war actually suits generally an incumbent president or prime minister, and would think that this might suit Netanyahu. But I'm not sure that that's the case when it comes to the Iran war, because the narrative around the Iran war is not hugely successful, nor is it that Netanyahu is in charge.
Well, it depends on which side of the narrative. But I mean, the exceptional thing about this issue of Iran specifically, and we saw this in June, we saw this in February, March, we saw this in all the different rounds of escalation with Iran, is that it really doesn't do much to the polling. Israelis are still committed to their votes, whether they're voting left or whether they're voting right or whether they're voting center. The map, right? We always discuss the map because obviously, we have to form a coalition government, and the map of the various possible coalitions doesn't really change depending on Iran or not Iran. We had a great conversation with Yair Lapid last week. All of our listeners, you should go on YouTube, you should listen to it because it was really inspiring and wonderful. And it wasn't directly about Israeli politics, but it was about Israeli society. And she said something. She said 80% of Israelis agree about 95% of the issues. Now, of course, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but the fundamental thing is, I think when it comes to the issues of our safety, of our security, and everyone views Iran as a real existential threat. Everyone views, the regime in Tehran as a real threat to our peace and our safety and to the peace and safety of the entire Middle East. So I think on that issue, it hasn't really become a political fault line. There's still relative consensus.
There are, of course, if there was to be a war during this period, let's say up until the election, there's obviously, what happens? Can you have an election if there are missiles falling? What happens if there's an active war on election day? Could it be postponed on those grounds? And there was another thing that I thought about, which is, as we know, there are Israelis who need to be in the country in order to vote, and their ability to fly home is actually very much dependent on whether or not there is a war, both because of the flights, but also because the airport is being used also by the US military. Tell me, we're going to do a little quiz as part of this episode, which is, what do you think the likelihood out of 10 is that there will be a war with Iran and it will impact an election?
Ooh, so those are two questions there, right? I think 1 out of 10 that there will be a war in Iran sometime before the elections. I'm putting that high up. I'm putting that on 7 and 8, right? Just by reading the room, right? By reading, the atmosphere in the Middle East, not just in Israel, and the atmosphere in the United States. It seems like that an escalation is coming. We thought it was coming this weekend, maybe next weekend. Now, for the second part of the question, the likelihood of the election being impacted with such a war, that's a long. I'd give it a 5. I'd give it a 5 because if we are in full-out war with Iran on October 27th, I don't see any situation where millions of Israelis can go out to the ballot box and vote under the threat of rocket fire from Iran. That's a no-brainer. How is that going to be possible? And what the impact of that is going to be, that's a big question.
So the other region that is heating up, sometimes I think everything's already so hot when they say heating up, you always wonder, can you boil above a boil? But certainly there is a continued conflict in Gaza, despite the ceasefire, and very much increase in violence in the West Bank, particularly by settlers, which creates a lot of tension, which can very quickly and very easily spill over. Those sorts of things tend to feed a bit of anti-Palestinian sentiment, but do you think that they have a practical impact on the election?
You mentioned the fact that that this government has tried to move away and erase the memory from October 7th because this was, this terrible catastrophe, and the government is being viewed by many Israelis as responsible, not for the attack itself, obviously, but responsible for the horrific calamity and the horrific scandal and the intelligence scandal that allowed for this attack to happen. But you go on Twitter and you see all the opposition, saying October 27th and using the graphic kind of image of October 27th, October 7th, and trying to link that and using all the, very standard opposition rhetoric against the government for being responsible for October 7th and for being responsible for this horrific tragedy that happened to us, and therefore the government needs to be ousted. That's the logic on one side. But immediately the comments from the right, from Netanyahu supporters, from people from the right of Netanyahu, say, we remember October 7th. We remember October 7th very well. That's exactly the reason we'll be voting for Netanyahu again. That's exactly the reason we'll be voting for the right again. Because this is what happens when you give Palestinians land. Because this is what happens when you have an Oslo mind state. So on the right, they remember October 7th well. They just draw the opposite conclusion. For them, it means I'll vote right. And any escalation of violence in the West Bank, and any escalation of violence in Gaza for that matter, may only tip them to the same conclusion.
From a practical and logistical point of view, though, on election day, the West Bank is always under curfew, so Palestinians aren't able to cross into Israel on that day, and obviously no one's crossing in from Gaza. So the impact would be probably more political than logistical. Tell me, what's the likelihood score of this happening and impacting the election?
Very high. 8 or 9. We're seeing violence in the West Bank stirring up, and we're seeing that violence both coming from the Palestinians, but also very unfortunately coming from Israelis, from Jewish settlers. And that's become the new norm. It used to be very rare, but it's becoming the new norm in the West Bank specifically, and Judea and Samaria. We discussed many times Netanyahu, not Netanyahu, the left, the right. But we have to remember that Netanyahu is also very, very much concerned about his opponents to the right of him. Specifically, Minister Ben-Gvir, who is very much to the right of Netanyahu, but many people in the Likud find themselves more and more associating with people like Ben-Gvir. And his whole line is very hard on the Palestinians, very, some would say, racist. And violence in the West Bank feeds into those narratives.
This election, I think, is one that differs from previous elections that I was around in Israel to vote for, and that's the threat of internal violence. So President Herzog, on the eve of Tisha B'Av, issued a warning saying elections are not a civil war. Everyone has noted that the heat is not only rising around the borders and from Iran, but the heat is rising internally. There's been violence in Haredi protests against the military draft. Obviously, as you've mentioned, the issue of settler violence in the West Bank. And he issued this warning on the eve of Tisha B'Av also because I think there's a lot of comparison, or people like to make the comparison between what's going on in Israel now and the periods of the First and Second Temples, or the destruction of the First and Second Temple, particularly the Second Temple, which fell due to, according to religious teaching, it fell due to Sinat Chinam. So yes, the Romans came and destroyed the temple, but it was the internal infighting that meant that the Jews were not able to withstand the Roman army. So that internal weakening creates a very big threat. We've also seen cases of bullying and intimidation of politicians on the street. And now, everyone's out with their phone cameras and everything goes on the internet. How do you see the issue of internal violence in Israel? What is the likelihood of this happening? What's the view from the inside?
The comparisons to Tisha B'Av, everyone loves them. Everyone makes them. But I think it's interesting to say that both sides accuse the other side of deliberately forcing us into Sinat Chinam and deliberately, ruining the fabric of Israeli society. It's a claim made by the left towards the right for obvious reasons, right? For the judicial overhaul and for the violent rhetoric, and, for ministers making very cynical and difficult comments about the left. But the right makes the same claim towards the left, specifically the claim that the left is most taking heat for by the right still. And up to this day, this is, they have to deal with this, is that during the protest movement, people who were opposed to the judicial overhaul introduced this new notion of ihitnadvut lemiluim. I'll explain, of not volunteering for their reserves duties until the judicial overhaul would be stopped. That was framed by the right as not volunteering. It was framed with a different word, salvanut. So you are refusing to serve. And that was a big heated debate. And for people who are part of the Israeli right, for people who support Netanyahu, for people who support the Likud, that's equivalent to being a traitor. And so they really accused the Israeli left and the opposers of the judicial overhaul with treason. And that's where the rhetoric becomes very violent.
And there are people to say that it is not equal on both sides, and that people who are more on the left have not actually gone and bullied and intimidated physically people on the right, while the opposite is true. When it came down to it, on October the 7th, everyone volunteered for the army. So it's an interesting narrative, but it's not really compliant with the facts. And it's sad to me that people will stick with a narrative rather than look at the facts of what actually happened when the country needed its soldiers. But I do think that some of the internal violence or friction also has to do with the fact that there are increasingly parts of Israeli society who are on a particular side of the political map, but let's just not mention that for now, neutrally, I will say, do not believe in the rule of law. And that is starting from the top down. So if the government can say, we will not follow High Court rulings, and we discussed this in our last episode. So obviously the people who support them are going to feel the same way. So it may not be violence, but certainly the government's statement prior to announcing the election that they would not follow necessarily a High Court ruling, and other hints that have been made, or vague statements have been made that they don't always feel bound by the High Court, that's also going to influence the next few months, because by nature electoral campaigns have a myriad of legal challenges that get involved in them, including, how the electoral booth is set up and who are the observers at the electoral booth, where can you protest, where can you campaign, these sorts of rules and laws that apply. So let's talk about where the High Court and its rulings are going to play into this election period.
No, this is a huge issue. For many of the Israelis who took to the streets 3 years ago to demonstrate the judicial overhaul with concern for Israel's deteriorating democracy and for these attacks on the system that keeps our democracy alive, for many of them, this concern is super big in this upcoming cycle of elections, because they don't have trust for the government, who has time and again made claims against the system, against the technical systems, against the judicial systems that have kept this thing going. I think one example is the Israeli National Election Committee. Now, the National Election Committee is always being seen as this archaic, technocratic, bureaucratic committee, right? To oversee that the elections are held fairly and okay. And it's never that dramatic, right? It's never been such an issue. The quality of the elections and the fairness of the elections in Israel have never been so scrutinized. And now this election committee is under a magnifying glass. You didn't ask if on a scale of 0 to 10, but I'm going to give it anyway. we're definitely going to see after this election, people on Twitter, depending on the results, of course. But if the results are not favorable for the current government, if they're not favorable for the right, we're for sure going to see allegations.
Do you think it can go as far as it did in the US with these accusations of a stolen election to this day, which Trump still says that 2020 was a stolen election? Do you think it can go that far?
I really hope it doesn't. I really, really hope it doesn't. But many educated Israelis would say yes, right? Would say yes to that question. Another point I'd like to make about the rule of law, and we said this last episode and I'll say it again, is that you cannot separate Israeli politics and the conversation around Israeli democracy from the conflict with the Palestinians. You cannot separate them, and specifically with the issue of rule of law regarding what's happening in the West Bank. Whether you call it settler violence, whether you call it Jewish terror, whether you call it nationalistic criminals, those are different definitions for the same phenomenon. They're very politicized definitions, but we won't go into that. But the idea that in the West Bank, it has become the new norm for violent groups of mainly teenagers, young men, to go out and act by themselves. Whatever happens there will soon trickle into the green line. I'll paint a scenario. Say we have a government of change, a full government of change. It's not the right anymore. It's the moderate right with the center, with the left, probably with an Arab party in some constellation, because that's how the numbers work. We have these accusations about an unfair election. We have these accusations about, this was stolen, or the Supreme Court. What if that happens? And then these groups that have, over the past few years, started festering in the West Bank decide to take their violence elsewhere. What if we have a mandatory conscription of Haredim? Haredim have made it very, very clear that they will die and not recruit, okay? And they have also made it clear that they have no problem blocking roads.
They haven't actually proved it.
Yeah, no, they haven't proved it, but that's the slogan, Namut v'lo nitgayes, right? So what if there is, talk of a proper mandatory conscription? And what if they get sent to jail by the masses because that is what the law requires? We could see an outbreak of violence that could completely destabilize the Israeli economy, the Israeli routine of life. So these are big topics that need to be addressed.
And I think what you've actually moved on to now is the election outcome and not just sort of the election period. And obviously something that I think is talked about a little bit less is that this government came out of the last of 5 elections between 2019 and 2022. And in 4 of the previous cycles, Netanyahu and his partners did not receive 61 votes. There was, I was there for it. I voted, I think, in 3 out of the 5 elections. April 2019, September 2019, March 2020, March 21, which was when this government of change, which was the Bennett-Lapid coalition, came into government. But they lasted only a year and a bit before some of their MKs defected to, and one of them is in Likud now. And then, of course, November 22, which brought this government into power and has been in power since the beginning of 2023. The hung election cycle, how likely is that to happen?
My assumption is that very likely, because again, all the numbers in all the polls are quite similar to what they were in all these previous hung election cycles. What we see is that the right, the Netanyahu right, that needs to be said, doesn't have the majority. It doesn't have more than 61 seats to form a coalition. And this is including the Haredim, including the far right. It doesn't have the seats to form the coalition that they have now. And the left as well doesn't have the seats, again, the left with the moderate right, with the center, right? These words are tricky these days, but they also don't have the numbers to do it on themselves. They'd have to incorporate one or more of the Arab parties, which we know is a very tricky thing to do. And we also have to factor in all these small parties in the center. If we look at Benny Gantz, if we look at the Reservist Party, there are all these small parties that are dangling below the 4-seat 3.2% of the vote threshold. And we spoke about that in one of our episodes, right? You have to have a minimum of 3.2% of the vote to gain a minimum of 4 seats in the Knesset. Otherwise, everyone who votes for you is kind of mathematically spread out amongst the other parties. And they can make a huge impact because when the numbers are so close, right, when it's neck and neck, and when no one has a clear majority in the Knesset, and then suddenly one of these makes it above or makes it below the threshold, that could be completely dramatic, and if a coalition will be able to be formed either by the left and center or by the Netanyahu right. So the chances for a hung election are quite high. They really are.
Give me a score out of 10.
I'll give it a 7 or an 8 for a hung election. Yeah. I'll give it a 7 or an 8.
And I think it's important to note that the impact of hung elections is not just that you have to go into more election cycles, but obviously you're working with a caretaker government this entire time. The ability for the government to function really as a government should is extremely limited. Israel didn't really have that luxury before. I don't think it has that luxury now to be without a clear leader and clear sense of leadership when, as we've mentioned at the beginning, these wars are ongoing and may not be concluded by the 27th of October. I said last week that the role of government and leadership in the tinderbox that is Israel, especially at the moment, is not to throw lit matches at it. In its last weeks, before the election was called, this government pushed through a number of laws, including the appointment of Netanyahu's own lawyer as state comptroller, which is what in Australia we would call the ombudsman. So many times the government pushes through extreme laws because they know that the High Court will knock it down. And so this is sort of a tactic to make the High Court the enemy that's restricting the government from ruling. But I think we need to pay attention to the way in which this government continues to make power grabs. In this election, the current coalition has told the Israeli voters exactly who they are and what they're willing to do. And I don't think that was the case in the previous election. And the judicial overhaul that was announced just weeks after the government came into power was really quite a shock. A lot of the voters for the government, especially on the right and Likud voters, the Haredim have not changed their demands around army exemptions and yeshiva funding, and the far right has not changed its corrosive and irresponsible approach to the occupation. Likud has not changed its assault on the democratic institution, including the gatekeeper positions that we've discussed, the media, the judiciary and the Attorney General. So if in the previous election the judicial overhaul came as a surprise and potentially some of the public could say, we didn't vote for this, that's not the case this time. This coalition has said exactly who they are. And for us in the diaspora, it's a moment that we need to realise that this is not just another election in Israel with its polling and the multiple parties and the nasty campaigning. It's a crossroads. And in my view, what could go wrong is that we in the diaspora miss the gravity of this moment and of what happens next to the Jewish homeland if we continue to leave it to the forces that are currently ruling it. We'll be back again to talk more about the election issues. Please give us a like or subscribe to Politica. You should also listen to some of TJI's other podcasts, and I'm listening to Tensions Transplanted. Thank you for listening to Politica, and until next time, keep the volume down.